The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the skylights of the Blackwood Archive. It was a sound that usually brought me comfort, a natural white noise that isolated this building from the rest of the world. But tonight, the rain felt different. It felt heavy, as if the water itself were trying to press through the glass, trying to drown the silence I had spent so many years cultivating. My name is Julian, and I am the sole archivist of the Sound Vault. Most people don't know we exist. We are a private collection tucked away in a district of the city where the streetlights always seem to flicker and the fog never truly lifts. We don't collect books or paintings or statues. We collect sounds. Wax cylinders from the turn of the century, magnetic tapes from the 50s, digital drives from the modern era. All of them containing echoes of things that no longer exist. The vault is a labyrinth of mahogany shelves and temperature-controlled glass cases. It smells of ozone, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying adhesive. I spend my nights digitizing these echoes, cleaning the static from voices long dead, and cataloging the cries of extinct birds or the mechanical whirring of machines that have been rusted into scrap for decades. It is a lonely profession, but I have always preferred the company of ghosts. They don't ask questions. They don't expect anything from you. They simply repeat their truth over and over until you turn them off. But 3 nights ago, a crate arrived with no return address. Inside, nestled in layers of damp straw, was a single, unmarked reel-to-reel tape. The plastic was a dull, sickly yellow, and the tape itself had a strange, iridescent sheen to it, like oil on water. There were no notes, no dates, no labels. I set the reel on the player, my fingers trembling slightly as I threaded the tape through the tension arms. I pressed play. For the first few minutes, there was only hiss, a deep, cavernous sound like the wind rushing through a tunnel miles underground. It was a cold sound. I could almost feel the temperature in the archive drop as the reels spun. Then, the static began to shift. It began to take shape. It wasn't a voice, not at first. It was the sound of a heartbeat, but it wasn't human. It was too slow, too rhythmic, like the tolling of a funeral bell submerged in thick syrup. Thump, pause, thump, pause. I found myself breathing in time with it, my lungs expanding and contracting with that agonizingly slow cadence. I adjusted the filters, trying to clean the audio, but the more I polished the sound, the more unsettling it became. Beneath the heartbeat, I heard a voice. It was a whisper, so faint that I had to press my headphones against my ears until they hurt. It was a woman's voice, speaking a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a lullaby, a song for someone who was never meant to wake up. I spent hours listening to that tape. The more I listened, the more I began to notice things in the archive. The shadows between the shelves seemed to grow thicker, less like an absence of light and more like a physical substance. I would turn my head, caught by a movement in the corner of my eye, only to find a row of silent tapes staring back at me. But the feeling of being watched was absolute. It was a gaze that didn't come from a person, but from the sound itself. It was as if the audio were a bridge, and something on the other side was starting to cross over. On the second night, the tape changed. I know how that sounds. Tapes don't change, they are fixed recordings. But when I played it again, the lullaby was gone. In its place was the sound of footsteps, heavy, wet footsteps walking on a stone floor. Slap, drag, slap, drag. They were coming closer to the microphone. I could hear the wetness of the impact, the sound of something saturated with water moving through a dark space. I checked the playback speed. It was correct. I checked the tape for splices. There were none. And yet the footsteps continued for 30 minutes, growing louder and louder until they seemed to be happening right behind my chair. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the archive was empty. Only the rows of mahogany shelves remained, bathed in the dim, amber glow of my desk lamp. But when I looked down at the floor, I saw it. A single, dark smudge on the floorboards. It looked like a damp footprint, fading even as I watched it. I reached out to touch it, my hand shaking. The wood was cold, ice cold, and it smelled of the sea, not the fresh, salty air of a beach, but the stagnant, suffocating smell of the deep ocean, where the light never reaches and things have been dead for 1,000 years. Tonight is the third night. The rain is still falling, harder than ever. I'm sitting at my desk, the yellow reel spinning slowly on the player. I haven't pressed stop. I can't. There is a hypnotic pull to the audio now, a magnetic attraction that makes it impossible to reach for the switch. The tape is no longer playing footsteps. It is playing the sound of a door opening. A very specific door. I recognize the creak of the hinges. I recognize the heavy thud of the latch. It is the sound of the main entrance to the sound vault, 3 floors above me. I am listening to my own reality being played back to me through the speakers. I hear the wind howling through the open door upstairs. I hear the wet footsteps beginning their descent down the spiral staircase. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Each step on the tape matches a vibration I can feel in the floor beneath my feet. The voice is back now too, the lullaby. But it isn't coming through the headphones anymore. It's coming from the hallway. It is a soft, wet sound, like someone trying to sing with a mouth full of seawater. "Julian," the voice whispers. It knows my name. The recording, a piece of plastic from a nameless crate, knows who I am. I realize now what this archive is. We aren't just collecting sounds, we are providing a home for them. We are giving them a place to settle, to grow, and eventually, to manifest. The sounds of the past don't want to be digitized. They don't want to be cleaned or cataloged. They want to be heard. They want to be felt. The footsteps are outside my door now. The reel is almost at its end. The sickly yellow tape is thinning, becoming transparent as it nears the hub. I can see a shape through the frosted glass of my office door. It is tall, thin, and dripping. The smell of the deep ocean is so thick now I can taste it on my tongue. The tape hiss is growing louder, a deafening roar of static that sounds like 1,000 voices screaming at once. But beneath the scream, the lullaby continues. It is so beautiful. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I find myself reaching for the door handle, not to lock it, but to open it. I want to see the face of the sound. I want to know what the end of the recording looks like. The reel stops. The end of the tape flaps against the player. Click, click, click. The door handle turns. "Julian," the voice says again, right against the wood. "The archive is full. It's time to make room for something new." I am not afraid. The rain is so loud now, it's all I can hear. It's a perfect sound. A perfect, final sound. I close my eyes. I take a deep breath of the cold, wet air, and I let the shadows take me. After all, an archivist's job is to preserve the silence. And tonight, the silence is going to be absolute. The snow does not just fall in the Iron Peaks. It claims. It descends from the bruised, purple sky not as delicate flakes, but as a shroud, heavy and absolute. I have lived in these heights for 40 years, carving a life out of stone and frozen timber, and I have learned one thing above all others. The cold is not an absence of heat, it is a presence. It is a living, thinking entity that waits for the fire to dim, for the blood to slow, and for the mind to wander. My name is Silas. I am a trapper, a man of the high ridges. My home is not a house, but a shallow cave, reinforced with heavy pine logs and packed with earth. It is a burrow, a place to hide from the wind that screams across the peaks with the sound of 1,000 dying horses. There are no machines here, no wires, no humming lights, only the orange flicker of a tallow candle and the rhythmic rasp of my whetstone against a steel blade. The great storm began on a Tuesday, though time in the peaks is measured more by the depth of the drifts than by calendars. It came with a silence that was more terrifying than any gale. The birds vanished first. The small, gray snowbirds that usually chatter in the scrub oak went mute and disappeared into the crevices of the rock. Then the wind stopped. The air became thick, crystalline, and so cold that every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. I sat by my small stone hearth, feeding it the precious dry cedar I had gathered in the autumn. I watched the smoke rise, thin and straight, toward the small vent in the roof. Outside, the world was turning white, a white so bright and uniform that it erased the horizon, the trees, and the very ground beneath one's feet. It is a phenomenon the old hunters called the veil. When the veil drops, you do not go out. To step into the veil is to step out of existence. By the second night, the silence began to speak. It started as a soft vibration in the stone walls of my burrow, a low, humming note that I felt in my teeth. I ignored it at first, attributing it to the pressure of the snow piling up on the mountain. But then the sound changed. It began to mimic the things I knew. I heard the crackle of a fire, though my own hearth was silent. I heard the scrape of a chair on a wooden floor, though there were no chairs here. And then I heard my mother's voice. She had been dead for 20 years, buried in the thaw soil of the valley far below. But here, in the heart of the Iron Peaks, her voice was as clear as a mountain spring. She was calling my name from just outside the heavy oak door of my shelter. "Silas," she whispered. "The fire is out, Silas. Let me in. It's so very cold." I gripped the handle of my knife until my knuckles turned as white as the snow outside. I knew the rules. The mountain does not just take your body, it tries to win your consent. It uses the things you love to draw you out into the white, where it can turn your heart into a shard of ice. I closed my eyes and recited the names of the peaks, the names of the rivers, the names of the trees, anything to drown out that impossible, beautiful voice. The third day brought the shadows. In the white silence, there is no depth perception. Everything is flat. But as I looked through the small, thick glass pane I had set into the door, I saw figures. They weren't ghosts. They were tall, spindly things made of frost and compressed air. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, gliding across the drifts without leaving a single footprint. They didn't have faces, only hollow depressions where eyes should be, filled with the swirling blue light of a glacier's heart. They didn't attack. They didn't try to break the door. They simply stood in a circle around my burrow, watching. Every time I looked out, they were closer. 10 yards, 5 yards, 2 yards. One of them stood so close that its long, crystalline fingers brushed against the glass. Where it touched, the frost formed a pattern that looked like a map of the mountain with a single red dot marking my location. The cold inside the cave began to intensify. My fire, no matter how much wood I piled on, produced no heat. The flames were a ghostly blue, dancing without warmth. My breath hung in the air like a frozen ghost, refusing to dissipate. I wrapped myself in every fur skin I owned, bear, wolf, and elk, but the chill wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from inside my bones. "The mountain is curious," a new voice said. This one wasn't my mother's. It was my own voice, but deeper, echoing as if spoken into a vast, empty hall. "It wants to know why you stay. It wants to know what it's like to feel warm." I realized then that the figures outside weren't predators, they were scouts. The mountain itself, The vast, ancient consciousness of the Iron Peaks was focusing its entire attention on this one small point of warmth. I was a flea on the back of a titan, and the titan had just noticed I was there. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of waking hibernation. I didn't eat, I didn't move. I simply sat by the blue, heatless fire and listened to the mountain breathe. I heard the grinding of tectonic plates miles below. I heard the slow, agonizing growth of crystals in the deep veins of the rock. I felt the weight of the millions of tons of ice pressing down on the slopes. The figures outside began to sing. It wasn't a melody that any human ear was meant to hear. It was a sequence of mathematical tones, a harmony of absolute zero. The sound vibrated through my skull, peeling back the layers of my memory. I saw my childhood. I saw the faces of every person I had ever known. I saw the moment I first climbed these peaks. And then, the mountain began to take those memories away. One by one, the faces faded. I forgot the name of the valley. I forgot the taste of an apple. I forgot the feeling of sun on my skin. The mountain was cleaning me, preparing me to become part of the white silence. On the final night, the door didn't break, it simply ceased to be. The wood turned to frost and crumbled into a fine, sparkling powder. The veil rushed in. The wind didn't howl, it was silent. A wall of pure, blinding white pushed into my burrow, snuffing out the blue fire and the tallow candle. I stood up, my furs falling away. I wasn't cold anymore. How could I be cold when I was becoming the cold itself? I stepped out of the burrow. The figures were gone, or rather, they were me and I was them. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent, glowing with that deep, glacial blue. My feet didn't touch the snow. I moved an inch above it, weightless and free. The Iron Peaks stretched out before me, no longer a hostile range of rock and ice, but a vast, shimmering nervous system. I could feel every snowflake falling. I could feel the heartbeat of the hibernating bears in the caves below. I could feel the slow, rhythmic pulse of the planet. There is no Silas anymore. Silas was a collection of warmth and memories that the mountain has processed and stored in its icy archives. There is only the white silence. And if you ever find yourself lost in the high ridges, when the wind stops and the veil drops, listen closely. You might hear a voice. It might sound like your mother, or your friend, or even yourself. It will tell you that the fire is out. It will tell you that it's time to come home. Don't fight it. The white silence is very, very patient. And in the end, it is so very peaceful. The ocean is not a body of water. It is a cathedral of weight, a vast, crushing pressure that holds the secrets of 10,000 years in its dark, salt-crusted lungs. I have lived on the eye of the abyss for 6 years now. It is a jagged tooth of volcanic rock sticking out of the North Atlantic, so small and so remote that the charts simply ignore its existence. On this rock stands the Light, a lighthouse built of black basalt, and beside it, the bell. My name is Thomas. I am the keeper. But I do not keep the light to guide ships. There are no shipping lanes here. I keep the light to watch the water. And I ring the iron bell to keep the things beneath the water from rising. The eye is a place of perpetual gray. The sky and the sea bleed into one another until you cannot tell where the spray ends and the rain begins. There is no wood here, no soil, no green life, only the slick black rock and the barnacles that cling to it like calcified teeth. My life is measured by the rhythm of the tides and the winding of the great brass clockwork that turns the lens. 3 nights ago, the tide didn't go out. I stood on the gallery of the lighthouse,
watching the moonless horizon. According to the almanac, the water should have receded, revealing the jagged fingers of the reef below. But the water stayed. It was flat, unnaturally calm, like a sheet of dark oil. There were no waves, no whitecaps, just a vast, silent swelling that rose higher and higher, inching up the black basalt walls of my tower. And then the sound began. It wasn't the sound of the sea. It was a vibration, a deep subsonic thrumming that came from miles below the seabed. It was the sound of something very large and very old breathing through the vents of the earth. I descended the spiral stairs, my boots echoing against the cold stone, and went to the bell. The bell is ancient, cast from a strange dark iron that never rusts. It is inscribed with runes that no sailor of this age can read. My instructions were simple, passed down from the keeper before me. When the water stops moving, ring the bell. Do not stop until the tide turns red. I took the heavy leather mallet and struck the iron. Bong! The sound was immense. It didn't just ring in the air, it rang in my bones. It rippled across the oily surface of the water, sending out perfect concentric circles. I struck it again. Bong! In the silence that followed, something broke the surface. About 50 yards from the rock, a cluster of pale, slender objects rose from the depths. At first I thought they were pieces of driftwood, or perhaps the masts of a sunken ship. But then they moved. They were fingers. Long, multi-jointed fingers, ivory white and translucent, each the size of a pine tree. They gripped the edge of the rock, the sharp basalt slicing into their flesh, but no blood came out. Instead, a thick, glowing phosphorescence leaked from the wombs, lighting up the dark water with a sickly neon green. I didn't scream. There is no one to hear a scream on the eye. I simply struck the bell again and again. The thing beneath the water began to pull itself up. I saw the curve of a skull, if you could call it that, a vast, dome-like expanse of bone that stretched for 100 feet. It had no eyes. It didn't need them. It felt the vibrations of the bell. It hated the sound. The iron bell was a splinter in its mind, a frequency that made its ancient cold cells ache. "Go back," I whispered, my voice lost in the roar of the iron. "The world of the sun is not for you." The fingers tightened. The lighthouse itself began to groan as the weight of the entity pressed against the foundation. I could smell it now, the scent of the primordial soup, of crushed shells and volcanic sulfur, and the absolute absence of life. It was the smell of the beginning of time. I climbed back up to the lantern room. I needed to see. I turned the lens manually, focusing the concentrated beam of light directly onto the white dome rising from the sea. When the light hit it, the creature shivered. Its skin was so sensitive that the mere touch of photons was like a cauterizing iron. It let out a sound, not a roar, but a high-pitched whistle that shattered the glass panes of the gallery. I was cut by a dozen shards of flying glass, but I didn't move. I kept the light fixed on that pale, pulsing mass. Below me, the bell began to ring on its own. The vibration of the creature's whistle was so intense that the iron bell was resonating in sympathy. The two sounds, the high whistle and the deep iron tolling, clashed in the air, creating a wall of sonic pressure that made my ears bleed. Then, the tide changed. From the cracks in the volcanic rock, a dark crimson liquid began to seep. It wasn't human blood, but it was warm. It flowed into the sea, swirling around the ivory fingers of the creature. As soon as the red touched the green phosphorescence, the water began to boil.
A thick, white steam rose into the air, smelling of iron and salt. The creature recoiled. The fingers slipped from the rock with a sound like wet leather being torn. It sank slowly, the vast white dome disappearing beneath the churning, red-stained waves. It didn't splash, it simply vanished, returning to the crushing pressure where it belonged. I stood in the shattered lantern room for hours, watching the red tide slowly dissipate into the vast, gray Atlantic. My hands were raw, my hearing was dulled to a dull roar, and the iron bell was finally silent. The water began to move again. Waves started to lap against the eye. The wind returned, bringing the familiar scent of rain. The world was normal again. But I know what is down there. I know that the lighthouse isn't a guide for the living. It is a cage for the dead. And the iron bell is not a signal. It is a lock. Every night now, I sit by the bell. I don't sleep for long. I listen to the silence of the water, waiting for it to become too flat, too calm. I look at the runes on the iron, and I wonder who cast this bell. I wonder how many other keepers are sitting on other rocks, watching other abysses, holding back the things that the light was never meant to touch. The ocean is very deep, and the red tide only lasts so long. One day, the bell will not be enough. One day, the fingers will not let go. But until that day, I will wind the clockwork. I will polish the lens. And I will stay ready, because the silence is coming back, and the bell is getting heavier every day. There is a specific kind of darkness that you can only find 1,000 feet beneath the surface of the earth. It is not the absence of light, it is something more substantial. It is thick, velvety, and heavy, pressing against your eyes until they ache from the effort of trying to find a single point of reference. I have spent most of my life in that darkness. I am a cavern hunter, a man who navigates the veins of the world, looking for the crystals and ores that the sun has never touched. My tools are simple: a heavy iron lantern, a pickaxe, and a spool of twine that serves as my only umbilical cord to the world above. I don't use maps. Maps are for the surface. Down here, the earth shifts, the rock breathes. You navigate by the tilt of the floor and the scent of the air. I found the maw on a Tuesday. It was a narrow slit in the limestone, hidden behind a curtain of weeping stalactites. The air coming from the opening didn't smell like the damp, mineral scent of most caves. It smelled of ozone and ancient dust, like a tomb that had been sealed before the first humans learned to walk upright. I squeezed through the opening, the cold stone scraping my chest and back until the walls suddenly vanished. My lantern light struggled to penetrate the space I had entered. It was a cathedral of stone, so vast that the ceiling was lost in the gloom. I stood there for a long time, the only sound being the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the distance. Plink, plink, plink. I began to walk, unrolling my twine as I went. The floor was smooth, almost polished, as if millions of feet had crossed it over thousands of years. But there were no footprints, only the dust, undisturbed and silver in the lamplight. After an hour of walking, I heard the echo. I had stopped to adjust the wick of my lantern. As the metal clinked, a sound came back from the darkness. But it didn't come back immediately. It arrived 5 seconds late, and it wasn't a perfect reflection of the sound I had made. It was slightly distorted, as if the darkness itself had chewed on the noise before spitting it back out. I tested it. I whistled a short, sharp note. I waited. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The whistle came back, but it was longer. It was a low, mournful sigh that sounded like a flute played by someone with too much breath. My skin prickled. I moved my lantern, the light dancing across the jagged formations of the cave, and that's when I noticed the silence was changing. The dripping water had stopped. In a cave, the silence is never truly silent. There is always the movement of air, the shifting of rock, the slow migration of water. But this was absolute. It was a vacuum of sound. It felt as though the cavern were holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I turned to follow my twine back to the entrance. I had seen enough. The ores I sought were not worth this feeling of profound wrongness. I reached down to grasp the string, but my hand met only empty air. I knelt, swinging my lantern low. The twine was there, lying on the stone floor, but it had been cut. Not frayed, not snapped by tension, but sliced cleanly. I picked up the end of the string. It was wet, not with water, but with something thick and translucent that smelled faintly of honey and rot. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice felt small, swallowed by the immense pressure of the stone above me. 5 seconds later, the echo returned. "Is someone there?" it asked. But the voice wasn't mine. It was the voice of a child, high-pitched, curious, and terrifyingly clear. I began to walk, faster now, trying to remember the path I had taken. I didn't have the string to guide me, but I knew the general direction of the slit in the limestone. But the cavern was different. The pillars of stone seemed to have shifted. The shadows moved independently of my lantern light, stretching and folding like dark wings. I heard footsteps, not mine. These were heavy, echoing thuds that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Thump, thump, thump. I stopped. The footsteps continued for 5 seconds, then stopped. The entity, whatever it was not following me. It was mimicking my movement, but with a delay. It was learning how I walked. It was learning the rhythm of my heart. I blew out my lantern. It was a desperate move, but I knew that in the dark, my other senses might sharpen. I sat in the absolute blackness, my back against a cold stalagmite, and I listened. I heard the sound of something sliding over the floor. It was a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper on silk. It was moving in a circle around me, closing the gap with every pass. And then the voice came again. This time, it didn't wait for me to speak. "Julian," it whispered. The name hit me like a physical blow. Julian was my brother. He had vanished in a mining accident 20 years ago. His body was never recovered. "Julian?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Help me, Elias," the voice replied. It was coming from right in front of me. I could feel a faint movement of air, a cold draft that smelled of the earth's deep, frozen core. I reached out my hand into the dark. My fingers brushed against something. It wasn't skin, it wasn't stone. It felt like cold, wet clay, but it was moving. It was soft and yielding, and as I touched it, I felt a vibration, a low, purring sound that resonated through my arm. I fumbled for my flint and struck a spark. For a fraction of a second, the cavern was illuminated. I didn't see my brother. I saw a mass, a vast, pale mound of flesh that filled the entire chamber. It had no eyes, no limbs, no features. It was a giant, living lung of the earth, pulsing with a slow, agonizing life. And embedded in its surface were things, tools, skulls, boots, pieces of twine, and faces. Dozens of faces were pressed against the translucent skin of the mass, their mouths open in a permanent, silent scream. I saw my brother's face. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared, preserved in that fleshy amber. The spark died. The darkness returned. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run. The cavern had no exit anymore. The limestone slit had been sealed by the shifting of the mountain. I felt the wet, clay-like substance wrap around my ankles. It was gentle, almost tender. It began to pull me toward the center of the mass. I heard the echo one last time, but it wasn't behind me. It was inside my head. "Don't worry," the voice whispered. "Nothing is ever lost down here. It is only remembered." I felt the cold skin of the mountain press against my cheeks. I felt my breath being shared with 1,000 other lungs. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, the darkness didn't feel heavy. It felt like home. Now, I am the echo. I wait for the next lantern light. I wait for the next whistle. And when it comes, I will answer, in a voice that sounds just like someone they love. There is a valley in the northern reaches of the Blackwood Forest that even the wolves avoid. The locals call it the Green Lung, but not because it brings life. They call it that because it breathes. In that valley, the vegetation does not grow by the season, it grows by the hour. Vines crawl like snakes across the forest floor, and the ancient willows have branches that hang like heavy, wet hair, reaching down to touch anyone who dares to walk beneath them. My grandfather was the last man to live in that valley. He was a wood-turner by trade, a man who understood the grain of every timber and the language of the roots. When he died, he left me his workshop, a small stone cottage buried so deep in the ivy that from a distance it looked like a natural mound of earth. "Never prune the willow at the well," his will had stated in a shaky, frantic hand, and never, under any circumstances, sleep with the windows unlatched. I arrived at the cottage in late autumn. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and rotting leaves. It was a heavy, sweet smell that made my head spin if I breathed too deeply. I spent the first few days clearing the path to the door, but by the next morning the briars had already grown back, thicker and thornier than before. It was as if the forest were trying to stitch itself shut, sealing me inside. The cottage was cold, but the wood stove was sturdy. I spent my evenings by the fire, listening to the forest. It wasn't the sound of wind in the leaves. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It sounded like thousands of tiny wooden fingers tapping against the stone walls, testing the mortar, looking for a way in. On the fourth night, I made a mistake. I was exhausted from a day of chopping wood, and I forgot to latch the small window in the loft. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound that was softer than a whisper. It was the sound of something sliding across the floorboards. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the pale moonlight filtering through the gap in the window, I saw it. A thin, green tendril, no thicker than a blade of grass, was inching its way across my blanket. It didn't move like a plant. It moved like an insect, sensitive and searching. It reached the edge of my hand and stopped. I felt a tiny, sharp prick like a needle, and then a warmth that spread slowly up my arm. I sat up and swatted it away, but as I did, I realized the room was full of them. Hundreds of tiny, translucent vines were pouring through the window, cascading down the walls like a waterfall of emerald silk. They weren't just growing, they were weaving. They were knitting themselves into the rug, the bedposts, and my clothes. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my lantern. The light revealed a terrifying sight. The willow tree outside the well had grown 10 feet in a single night. Its branches had elongated, pushing through the glass of the loft window, their tips glowing with a faint bioluminescent light. And the tree was singing. It wasn't a voice, it was the sound of wood rubbing against wood, a deep, creaking melody that resonated in the pit of my stomach. As the song grew louder, the vines in the room began to vibrate. I felt my own muscles start to twitch in time with the music. My skin felt tight, as if something were pulling at it from the inside. I ran down the stairs, but the ground floor was already gone. The ivy had burst through the floorboards, turning the kitchen into a jungle of twisted green. The smell of the sweet rot was overwhelming now. I felt heavy, my limbs moving as if through water. I reached for the front door, but the wood had fused with the frame. The oak had come back to life, the grain swirling and hardening until the door was part of the wall again. I was trapped in a living cage. I looked down at my hands. Small, green shoots were beginning to emerge from beneath my fingernails. They weren't painful. In fact, they felt wonderful. They felt like belonging. I felt the deep, ancient wisdom of the soil calling to me, promising me a life without thought, without pain, without fear. A life of pure, eternal growth. "Come back to the earth," the creaking wood seemed to say. "Give us your bones, and we will give you the sky." I fought it. I found my grandfather's old iron hatchet under the sink. Iron, the only thing the forest feared. I swung the blade into the door, and the wood screamed. A thick, milky sap sprayed out, smelling of ancient dust and copper. I hacked and carved, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the vines wrapped around my ankles, trying to pull me down into the soft, dark earth beneath the floorboards. I burst through the door and collapsed into the garden. The willow was reaching for me, its long, hair-like branches swaying in the windless air. I didn't stop. I ran through the briars, the thorns tearing at my skin, until I reached the edge of the valley where the trees turned back into normal, silent wood. I never went back. I left everything, my grandfather's tools, my clothes, my memories of that place. Sometimes, when I am in a park or near a garden, I see a willow tree swaying in the breeze. Most people see beauty. I see a predator. I see the way the branches reach down, searching for a pulse. And every now and then, late at night when the world is quiet, I feel a tiny, sharp prick beneath my fingernails. I look down, and for a second, I think I see a flash of green. The forest doesn't forget a debt. It just waits for the next time I fall asleep. And next time, I might not want to wake up. There is a valley in the shadows of the Black Mountains where the mist never truly clears. In the center of this valley lies a village called Oakhaven. It is a place of beautiful stone cottages, perfectly swept streets, and gardens that are always in bloom. But if you were to walk through Oakhaven at noon, you would notice something missing. There are no dogs barking. There are no children laughing. There are no blacksmiths hammering at their anvils. The village is perfectly preserved, yet utterly silent. My name is Silas, and I stumbled into Oakhaven when my horse threw a shoe on the mountain pass. I walked into the village square expecting to find a tavern or a stable. Instead, I found a feast. In the center of the square, a long wooden table was set with porcelain plates, silver cutlery, and steaming platters of roasted meat and fresh bread. The smell was intoxicating, rosemary, garlic, and sweet wine. But there was not a single soul in sight. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed against the stone walls, sounding harsh and intrusive in the heavy stillness. I waited. No one answered. But as I turned to look at the nearest house, I saw a curtain flutter. Just a tiny movement, as if someone had been watching me and quickly stepped back into the shadows. I sat at the table, my hunger overcoming my unease. I took a piece of the bread. It was warm, as if it had been taken out of the oven only seconds ago. I ate in silence, the only sound being the scrape of my knife against the plate. But the more I ate, the more I felt a strange sensation, a feeling that the silence wasn't empty. It was crowded. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the atmosphere changed. The shadows didn't just lengthen, they seemed to detach themselves from the buildings. And then, I heard it. The first footfall. It was a soft, barefoot sound on the cobblestones. Pad, pad, pad. I looked toward the sound, but there was no one there. Then another sound came from behind me. Pad, pad, and another from the left. Within minutes, the square was filled with the sound of hundreds of invisible feet moving softly around the table. "Who are you?" I whispered, my heart racing. A voice answered, but it didn't come from the air. It came from the ground beneath my feet. It was a chorus of whispers, thousands of them, overlapping like the rustle of dry leaves. "We are the residents," the voices said. "We are the caretakers of the quiet." I looked down and saw them. They weren't ghosts, not exactly. They were reflections. In the polished surface of the silver spoons, in the wine in my glass, and in the puddles between the stones, I saw the people of Oakhaven. They were dressed in fine, old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and their eyes wide. They were standing all around me, but they occupied a space that I could not see. "Why are you hiding?" I asked, staring into the dark wine in my cup. "We are not hiding," a woman's reflection replied. She was standing right behind my chair in the reflection, her hand hovering over my shoulder. "We are protecting the peace. Noise is a debt, Silas. Every sound you make, every word you speak, every breath you take, it creates a ripple. And there are things in the mountains that follow the ripples." As she spoke, I heard a sound from the high peaks. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a high, thin, whistling sound, like a needle scratching across a glass plate. The reflections in the square all shivered. The water in my glass vibrated. "It is the Sound Eater," the whispers hissed. "It has been hunting us for centuries. It followed our songs. It followed our laughter. It followed the sound of our heartbeats. So we learned to be still. We learned to live in the reflection, where the sound cannot reach." The whistling grew louder, more piercing. I felt a sharp pain in my ears. I wanted to cover them, but I was frozen in place. "You brought a great deal of noise with you, Silas," the woman's reflection said. "Your horse, your boots, your voice. The Sound Eater is very hungry tonight." I looked up at the sky. A shape was descending from the stars. It looked like a vast, tattered cloak of darkness, hundreds of feet wide, with no head and no limbs. It didn't fly, it drifted on the vibrations of the air. It was a void, a hole in reality that consumed every frequency it touched. The reflections in the wine glass began to reach up. Their hands emerged from the liquid, cold and translucent, grasping my wrists. "There is only one way to save the village now," they whispered. "You must give us your sound. You must become a reflection." I felt my voice being pulled from my throat. It felt like a physical weight leaving my body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My heartbeat slowed, becoming a silent pulse of light. I felt my body becoming thin, two-dimensional, until I was pulled down, deep into the dark, still water of the wine glass. I looked up from the surface of the wine. I saw my own body sitting in the chair, but it was empty, a hollow shell of skin and bone. The dark shape in the sky swept over the square, its tattered edges brushing against the table. It searched for a sound, a vibration, a heartbeat, but there was nothing. The Sound Eater let out one final, frustrated whistle and drifted back toward the peaks, seeking easier prey in the valleys beyond. I am still here in Oakhaven. I spend my days sweeping the streets and my nights setting the table for the travelers who occasionally wander in. We are very kind to them. We feed them the best food and we give them the finest wine. And when the sun begins to set, we ask them for their sound. If you are ever lost in the Black Mountains and you find a village that is too clean and too quiet, do not call out, do not whistle, and whatever you do not drink the wine, because the silence here is very hungry, and it is always looking for a new voice to add to the chorus of the reflections. I never thought a minimum wage gig at a local park would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. It was Easter Saturday. I was 20, broke, and desperately needed cash for tuition. So, when the city's events coordinator offered me $80 to wear a giant, suffocating rabbit costume for 6 hours, I took it. The job was simple. walk around the community park, hand out chocolate eggs, and take photos with kids. The suit was old, a heavy faux fur thing with a permanent frozen smile and large, unblinking plastic eyes. From the inside, my vision was limited to 2 small mesh circles in the neck. It was hot, it smelled like old basement, and it was exhausting. By 4 p.m., the crowd started to thin out. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the grass. I was heading toward the staff tent to finally strip off the headpiece when I saw him. He was standing near the edge of the woods, about 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was a reflection or another staff member. He was wearing a costume almost identical to mine. But as I squinted through the mesh, I realized something was wrong. His suit wasn't clean and white like mine. It was a dull, sickly gray, stained with what looked like dried mud, or worse. The ears weren't standing up. They were flopped forward, covering half of the mask's face. He wasn't handing out eggs. He wasn't waving. He was just standing there, watching me. I waved, thinking maybe it was a coworker playing a prank. He didn't wave back. He didn't move an inch. A cold shiver ran down my spine despite the heat inside my suit. I hurried into the tent, ripped off the heavy rabbit head, and gasped for fresh air. "Hey, is there anyone else out there in a bunny suit today?" I asked the coordinator. She looked at her clipboard, confused. "No, just you. Why?" I looked back out through the tent flap. The edge of the woods was empty. The gray rabbit was gone. I told myself it was just a parent in a costume, or maybe my mind playing tricks after hours of heat exhaustion. I changed into my regular clothes, jeans and a black hoodie, grabbed my backpack, and headed for the subway. But as I swiped my card at the turnstile, I felt that prickle on the back of my neck again. I turned around. There, standing behind a concrete pillar in the station, was the gray ear. Just the tip of it, peeking out. He had followed me. He wasn't a parent, he wasn't staff, and the way he moved, silent, rhythmic, never losing sight of me, told me this wasn't a holiday joke. This was a hunt. The subway ride was a blur of fluorescent lights and cold sweat. I sat in the middle of the carriage, my back pressed against the hard plastic seat, staring at the glass door leading to the next car. He was there, the gray rabbit. He wasn't sitting down. He was standing, gripping the metal pole with a gloved hand that looked too large, too human. Through the reflection in the window, I could see the commuters around him, a woman reading a book, a teenager on his phone. None of them looked up. None of them saw the filth on the fur, or the way the rabbit's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, staring directly at me through the connecting glass. When the train screeched into my station, I didn't wait for the doors to fully open. I squeezed through and bolted for the stairs. My heart was a drum in my chest, echoing against the tiled walls. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just needed to get to my street, to my building, to my locks. The night air was crisp, but I was burning up. My apartment was 3 blocks away, a quiet residential stretch lined with old oak trees. Usually, the orange glow of the street lamps felt warm and welcoming. Tonight, they created long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for my ankles. I reached my building and fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped them twice. The metallic jingle felt like a siren in the silent street. I snatched them up, unlocked the heavy main door, and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned my back against the wood, gasping, waiting for the sound of a heavy body hitting the door. Silence. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs in total darkness, not wanting to trigger the hallway lights and announce my position. When I reached the 3rd floor, I slipped into my apartment and threw every bolt on the door. I leaned my head against the cool surface of the wood, closing my eyes. "You're safe," I whispered to the empty room. It was just a freak, a weirdo in a suit. He's gone. I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, my legs feeling like lead. That's when I noticed it. A small, rhythmic sound. It was coming from the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was the sound of something soft, like fabric or matted fur, brushing against the wood. My breath hitched. I crept back to the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. I leaned toward the peephole. I hesitated, my stomach turning. Part of me didn't want to look. Part of me wanted to stay in the dark forever. But I had to know. I pressed my eye to the small glass lens. The hallway light outside was off, but the emergency exit sign cast a dim, red glow over the landing. And there, filling the entire field of vision, was a giant, plastic eye. It was yellowed and scratched, reflecting the faint red light like the eye of a predator in the woods. He wasn't standing back. He was pressed right up against the door, his own eye aligned perfectly with the peephole. He was looking back at me. And then the sound changed. The scraping stopped. I looked down at the floor. A small, thin shadow was stretching into my apartment from the hallway. My heart stopped. I hadn't turned the deadbolt all the way. The door wasn't fully latched. There was a tiny 1-inch gap between the door and the frame, a gap I had left in my panic. Through that gap, I saw the tip of a gray, matted ear slowly sliding inside. And then, the brass handle began to turn. Slowly, quietly. He didn't want to break in. He wanted to be invited. Moving to Blackwood Creek was supposed to be our fresh start. My wife, Sarah, and I had spent 5 years in the suffocating noise of the city, and we were tired. We wanted a place where the air smelled like pine needles instead of exhaust, and where the loudest sound at night was the wind in the trees. We found a small white house on the edge of town just 3 weeks before Easter. The locals were welcoming, almost too welcoming. Every time I stepped out to grab the mail, there was someone there. A neighbor waving from across the street, a local baker dropping off a loaf of bread just because. But it was Mr. Henderson who really took an interest in us. He lived in the house directly opposite ours. He was a man in his 60s, always dressed in ironed sweaters, with a smile that was perfectly symmetrical, yet his eyes remained as cold and flat as 2 gray stones. On Good Friday, he leaned over our wooden fence, his hands gloved in yellow leather. "You're the new life this town needed," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "You must come to the Founders Hunt on Easter Sunday. It's held at the Blackwood Estate. It's an old tradition, a way for us to welcome those who have chosen to join our fold. Newcomers always get a head start. It's only fair." Sarah loved the idea. She wanted to fit in. I had a knot in my stomach, a cold stone of intuition that I chose to ignore because I didn't want to be the paranoid city guy. Easter Sunday arrived with a heavy, gray sky. The Blackwood Estate sat deep in the valley, a crumbling Victorian titan surrounded by miles of neglected apple orchards. The trees were gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers clawing at the fog that rolled in from the hills. As we pulled up in our car, I noticed the silence. No music, no children playing, just 50 or 60 adults standing in a wide circle on the overgrown lawn, each clutching an empty wicker basket. They were dressed in dark coats, their faces pale and solemn. "The rules are simple," a tall man in a black suit announced. He didn't look like an event organizer, he looked like a funeral director. "The golden eggs are hidden deep within the old orchard. To the first couple who finds 3, a prize will be given. Newcomers, you go first." The crowd parted in eerie silence. Sarah gripped my hand, her palms sweaty. We stepped into the orchard, and within seconds, the fog swallowed the mansion. The light was fading fast, turning the world into shades of bruised purple and deep black. We wandered for what felt like hours. The ground was soft and damp, muffled our footsteps. The air tasted like wet earth and rot. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping dead. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart beginning to thud against my ribs. Nothing, that's the problem. There are no birds, no crickets, nothing. She was right. The woods were dead. We kept walking, hoping to find a path back, when Sarah's foot caught on something hard under a pile of dead leaves. She stumbled, nearly falling. I knelt down, clicking on my small flashlight. I expected a root or a rock. Instead, the beam hit blue nylon. It was a backpack. I brushed away the leaves and dirt, revealing a logo I recognized. It belonged to the Millers, the young couple who had lived in our house before us. Mr. Henderson had told us they moved back to the city overnight. I unzipped it. My breath hitched. Inside were their house keys, a set of car keys, and a wallet. I opened the leather bifold. Jonathan Miller's driver's license stared back at me. There were $300 in cash still inside. Nobody leaves their wallet and keys behind when they move. Nobody. A sickening realization washed over me. This wasn't a game. The founder's hunt wasn't about finding eggs. It was a calculated distraction to get the targets away from their property. While we were out here, lost in this labyrinth of trees, the rest of Blackwood Creek wasn't at the mansion. They were at our house. But they weren't there to steal. They were there to erase any trace that we ever existed. Just like they had done to the Millers. "Sarah, we have to run. Now," I hissed, grabbing her arm. "What? Why? What did you find?" "They didn't move, Sarah. They're still here. Somewhere." We turned to sprint back toward the direction of the mansion, but the fog was a wall. Every tree looked identical. And then a light clicked on, 30 yards to our left, a bright, blinding LED beam. Then another to our right, and another behind us. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the mist. They weren't running. They were walking with the slow, deliberate pace of people who knew their prey had nowhere to go. Mr. Henderson stepped into the circle of my flashlight. He wasn't wearing his sweater anymore. He had on a heavy, wax-coated hunting jacket. In his hand, he held a wicker Easter basket, but it wasn't filled with chocolate or painted eggs. Inside were heavy, rusted tools, a sledgehammer, a pair of bolt cutters, and a long, jagged saw. "The tradition is very specific," Henderson said, his voice devoid of the neighborly warmth he had faked for weeks. "The town needs to stay pure. We don't like outsiders changing our rhythm. The Millers didn't understand that, and I can see by the look in your eyes, neither do you." He raised the sledgehammer, the rusted metal catching the faint moonlight. Behind him, the other neighbors closed the circle, their empty baskets ready to be filled with whatever was left of us. The hunt wasn't over. It was just reaching the harvest. I've always lived alone. I like the silence. My apartment is on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind where you have to buzz people in and the stairs creak under even the lightest step. It felt safe, like a fortress. Or at least it did until Easter Sunday. I wasn't planning on celebrating. I had some work to catch up on and a bottle of wine in the fridge. But when I came home from a quick grocery run around 6 p.m., I found it. Right there, sitting on my welcome mat. A wicker basket, beautifully wrapped in clear cellophane with a massive yellow bow. I looked up and down the hallway. Empty. I listened for the sound of the heavy fire door closing or footsteps on the stairs. Nothing. I picked it up. It was heavy. Through the plastic, I could see expensive chocolates, a bottle of high-end red wine, and a small, handwritten envelope. I brought it inside, locked the deadbolt, and set it on the kitchen island. I opened the card first. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and feminine. To my favorite neighbor. I've been watching you from afar, and I thought you deserved a treat this Easter. Enjoy. Your secret admirer. My first thought was that it was a mistake. I didn't really know my neighbors. My second thought, fueled by a bit of ego, was that maybe the girl from 4B had finally noticed me. I unwrapped the basket. The smell of expensive cocoa and aged wine filled the room. I poured myself a glass and started on the chocolates. They were delicious, dark, rich, and perfect. I spent the next hour on my laptop, the wine slowly making my head feel heavy. A bit too heavy. My vision started to blur at the edges, and a strange metallic taste settled in the back of my throat. I figured I was just tired. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The wine has a nice finish, doesn't it? Better than the chocolates? My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. I looked at the bottle. I looked at the empty wrappers. How did they know? I looked at my window. The blinds were shut tight. I live on the 4th floor. There's no fire escape. Nobody can see in. I picked up the phone to reply, but another message popped up. A photo. It was a shot of me, taken from inside my own living room, looking at the card. I was sitting at the kitchen island. The angle was low, like it was taken from floor level. I dropped the phone. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I tried to stand, but I collapsed back into the chair. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the basket. I began to rip the decorative grass out of the bottom of the wicker frame. There, tucked into a small slit in the wood, was a tiny, blinking red light. A GPS tracker. But that wasn't all. Next to it was a small, high-definition pinhole camera disguised as a decorative plastic egg. He hadn't been watching me from the street. He'd been watching me from my own kitchen island. Another text. Check the bedroom. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, the muscles refusing to work. I dragged myself across the floor, my fingers clawing at the hardwood. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open. The room was dark, except for the pale moonlight hitting the bed. On my pillow sat another yellow bow. And under the bed, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a phone vibrating on the floorboards. I realized then that the secret admirer hadn't just left a gift. He'd used the delivery as a way to make sure I was occupied while he found a place to stay. He wasn't outside. He was inches away from me. The wine wasn't just wine, it was a sedative. As my eyes began to close against my will, I saw a hand reach out from under the bed. It was wearing a thin, white lace glove. In the hand was a small, sharp paring knife, the kind you'd use to peel an apple. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was a soft, feminine whisper that didn't sound like a woman at all. "Happy Easter. I told you that you deserved a treat."